7 years ago, the Duke of Fenmore stood at the window of his study and gave his governess 1 hour to pack her trunk and leave his house with a thief's name fastened to her back. He did not look at her while he said it. He looked at the snow. Tonight, in the great hall of that same house, in front of 140 invited guests, that man went down on his knees on the marble and begged her to forgive him. The county watched the most feared duke in Derbyshire lower himself to the floor of his own hall, and the county could not produce one sound between them. What happens in 7 years to turn one of those men into the other? It takes a war. It takes a dying woman's confession and a lie he should never have believed. Welcome to the Governess Hour. I am going to tell you a story tonight that will make you feel things. You know how these stories usually go on this channel. The Duke watches. The Duke counts every insult. The Duke waits, and then the Duke makes the cruel ones pay. Tonight is different, and I want you to know that before we begin. Tonight the Duke is the one who commits the cruelty. The humiliation in this one is specific, the worst that could be done to a woman in her position. An accusation of theft and 1 hour to leave without a reference. And the reckoning, when it comes, is proportionate. It simply falls on a man who deserves it and loves her anyway. This is the Governess Hour. Drop your location in the comments before we begin. Tell me your city and your local time. Whether it is morning coffee in Melbourne or 2, in the morning in Manchester, I read every single one, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. Felicity Crane was the finest governess the county had seen in a generation, and the man who held her entire future in his hands threw her into the January roads on the strength of a planted brooch. This is the story of what that hour cost her, what 7 years taught him, and what it looks like when the most powerful man in Derbyshire finally understands that the only person whose forgiveness he needs is the one person on earth who owes him nothing. Our story begins in the winter of 1851, in a house called Larkmoor. Larkmoor sat in the hollow of a Derbyshire valley, like something the hills had decided to keep. It held bedrooms, a library 2 stories high, a great hall floored in Italian marble that had crossed the sea in pieces, and a man at the centre of it whom the county discussed in the same tone it used for the weather, on the high moor, which is to say with respect and at a distance. Warwick, 6th Duke of Larkmoor, was 31 years old that winter. He held more of Derbyshire than the Crown did. He sat on committees in London whose decisions moved grain prices in 3 counties, and he had buried both his parents before his 25th birthday, which left him with a title, a fortune of some 40,000 a year, and a half-sister of 9 years old named Lady Dinah, who was the only person at Larkmoor permitted to interrupt him. Felicity Crane had come to Larkmoor 18 months earlier to teach that child. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a Shrewsbury schoolmaster who had taught her Latin and mathematics, as though she were a son, and then died without leaving her anything else. She had taken the position at £26 a year, which was generous, and she had learned, within her first week, the geography that governs every governess. The schoolroom and the nursery corridor belonged to her. The servants' hall did not want her because she spoke like the family. The drawing room did not want her because she was paid. She took her meals alone at a small table in the schoolroom, and she had grown so accustomed to it that she no longer noticed the footman's pause at the door, the slight adjustment a man makes when he cannot decide whether he is serving a lady or delivering to staff. Now, before we go further, it is important to understand exactly what a governess was in 1851, because everything that happens in this story turns on it. England had created a position with the obligations of a lady and the protections of no one. A governess had to be educated because she taught the children of the educated. She had to be genteel because she shaped the manners of gentlefolk, and she had to be poor because no woman with any alternative would take the work. She ranked above the servants, who resented her for it, and below the family, who reminded her of it. And she lived suspended between the two floors of a great house, with the vulnerabilities of both and the privileges of neither. Census takers that decade counted some 25,000 of these women in England. Nearly every one of them was a single bad month away from having nothing at all. When Felicity Crane sat down alone at her schoolroom table each evening, she was not merely eating supper. She was occupying the exact centre of the loneliest position Victorian England ever invented. She bore it because of the child. Lady Dinah had arrived in her care, a sullen, frightened girl who had been through 4 governesses in 3 years, and Felicity had done what her father taught her to do, which was to find the locked door in a child's mind and stand beside it without rattling the handle until the child opened it herself. By that winter, Dinah could decline 4 Latin nouns, multiply 3 figures in her head, and recite the kings of England backwards as a parlour trick, and she performed all of it with the child who has discovered she is clever. The Duke noticed. He was a man who noticed everything and remarked on almost none of it, but he noticed. The first time he spoke to Felicity directly, beyond the courtesies of a corridor, she had been at Larkmoor for 400 days. She knew the number because she had a habit, inherited from her father, of keeping a small accounting of her life in the back pages of her commonplace book. He came into the schoolroom unannounced on a November afternoon, while Dinah was construing a passage of Caesar aloud, and he stood inside the door and listened to the end of it without a word. Dinah finished. The Duke looked at the page over his sister's shoulder, and then he looked at Felicity. "She reads it as sense," he said, "not as a puzzle. Her last 4 teachers never managed the first sentence. Caesar wrote, 'To be understood, Your Grace.' The puzzle was added later, by people who teach." A muscle moved at the corner of his mouth and stopped. He stayed 11 minutes. He asked Dinah 3 questions and Felicity 2, and when he left, the schoolroom held the shape of him for the rest of the afternoon, as a room holds cold air after a door has been opened onto winter. Also resident at Larkmoor that winter was Miss Selina Vane. She was the Duke's cousin, 26, orphaned young, and raised half her life under that roof, and since the old Duchess's death, she had served as hostess of the house. Selina presided over the dinners. She arranged the flowers and the seating and the invitations, and she had spent 10 years learning Larkmoor like a chatelaine, counting the keys she expects to hold, and the entire county understood, though no one had announced it, and no one ever would, that Miss Vane intended to be the next Duchess of Larkmoor, and that the Duke had neither confirmed it nor troubled himself to deny it. Selina Vane was beautiful in the manner that photograph badly and rules a dinner table absolutely. She had been pleasant to Felicity for 18 months, with the pleasantness a woman extends to furniture that answers questions. It cost her nothing, because the governess was nothing. And then, in the space of 1 November fortnight, the Duke visited the schoolroom 3 times, and Selina's pleasantness acquired an edge you could have shaved with. It began at the foot of the great staircase, on a Thursday morning, with Dinah holding Felicity's hand and chattering about the Romans. Selina came down the stairs, drawing on her gloves. "Miss Crane, my cousin tells me Dinah construes Latin now." She worked the kid leather down over each finger without looking up, How singular. I always say there is something faintly tragic about an educated woman in service. All that Latin, and no one to spend it on but a child. Your father can hardly have intended it. My father intended me to be useful, Miss Vane, and so you are. Selina reached the bottom step and smiled at the child, and the smile included felicity, as lamplight includes the corner of a room. Enormously useful. We all say so. She moved past them toward the morning room, and the scent of her hothouse violets hung in the stairwell after her. Dinah's hand pulled at Felicity's. What does singular mean? It means unusual, my lady. Are you unusual? Felicity looked down at the small upturned face and felt the question land somewhere beneath her stays, in the place where she kept everything she was not paid to say. I am a governess, she said. We come one to a household. That is as singular as I am permitted to be. But she had no idea, walking back up to the schoolroom that morning, what had already begun to take shape in the rooms below her. None at all. December brought the frost down off the moor, and brought the Duke home from London for the winter, and with him came a change in the rhythm of the house that everyone below stairs could read, and no one above stairs would admit to. He began to use the library in the evenings. This was remarked upon because for 6 years the library had been a room the maids dusted, and no one entered. 2 stories of his grandfather's books behind glass, and the 6th Duke had been a man who lived in his study among ledgers and letters. Now the library fires were lit nightly, and because the library was where Felicity Crane had been given leave, in her first month, to borrow what she liked at whatever hour the schoolroom did not claim her, the geography of the house had quietly arranged for the 2 of them to be alone in a room together, 3 or 4 evenings in any week, with no one able to say that anyone had arranged anything. He never sat near her. That has to be understood about the man. He took the desk at the north end with his correspondence, and she took the chair by the south fire with whatever she was reading, and 60 feet of Turkey carpet and his grandfather's books lay between them, and for the first 3 evenings neither of them spoke at all. On the 4th evening he asked her, across the whole length of the room, what she made of a pamphlet on the education of girls that was then making noise in the reviews, and she told him, and he argued, and she argued back, and at midnight the under-footman banking the hall. Fires heard the Duke of Larkmore laugh, and reported it in the servants' hall the next morning, and was not believed. It went on like that through December. They talked about books, which is how 2 careful people talk about themselves. She learned that he had wanted the navy as a boy and been refused it, because dukes are not spent at sea. He learned that her father had died mid-sentence over a Greek lexicon, and that she had finished the page for him before she let herself cry, because the page was owed to a pupil in the morning. He learned that she was funny, which no one at Larkmore had troubled to discover in 18 months. She learned that his silence was not coldness. It was a fortification built by a boy who had buried his mother at 19 and his father at 24, and had concluded that the safest things to love were acreage and a small sister in that order, because acreage cannot die. She also learned to watch herself. A governess who is talked to by the master of the house has been handed a lit candle in a hayloft, and Felicity Crane was nobody's fool. She rationed the library, made herself miss evenings she ached to keep, and addressed him as Your Grace in every 3rd sentence, like a woman touching a wall in the dark to be sure of the room. And it changed nothing, because the thing growing in that library did not live in the words. It lived underneath them, and you cannot ration what is underneath. One evening, shortly before Christmas, reaching to return a volume of Donne, to its shelf, she found the gap too high, and before she had finished rising to her toes, he reached over her shoulder, took the book, and slid it home. She had not heard him cross the room. The length of him stood at her back, close enough that she could feel the warmth come off his coat, and neither of them moved for the space of 4 heartbeats, and then she stepped sideways along the shelf, and he stepped back, and she said something about do, and he said something about the hour, and the 60 feet of carpet went back between them. But her hand was unsteady on the banister all the way up to the nursery floor, and in his ecstasy the next morning the Duke of Fenmore wrote half a letter to his man of business, stopped, and sat for a quarter of an hour, looking at nothing the window could account for. Selina Vane watched all of it. That is the thing about a woman who runs a house. The house reports to her. She knew the library fires were lit, and for whom. She knew the Duke had laughed. She had spent 10 years of her life on an unspoken understanding, 10 years of arranging his dinners and deferring her seasons and turning down a baronet and a younger son who would have had her because she was holding herself for a coronet. And she watched the man she had invested her entire existence in walk past her each evening toward a room that held a schoolmaster's daughter in a grey dress and something in Selina very quiet and very busy, like a kitchen after the order has come up and the work has begun. Her needles came out at dinner, where the governess could not answer because the governess was not there. "One does worry," she said to the table at large, 2 nights before Christmas, about Dinah forming her manners on a hired woman. The accent is correct, I grant you. It is the ideas underneath I cannot vouch for. Schoolmasters' daughters are bred to think themselves remarkable. It is all they inherit. The vicar's wife laughed. The Duke looked down the length of his own table at his cousin for a moment, that several guests remembered afterwards, and said that Dinah's ideas were the best part of her manners, and the conversation moved on, and Selina smiled and signalled the footman for the next course, and under the table her hands lay folded in her lap like something coiled. On Christmas Eve the house went to church in the snow, and came back to candles and wassail, and by 11 the family had gone up, and Felicity went down to the library to fetch the book of carols. Dinah wanted for the morning, and the Duke was there. There was no correspondence on the desk, just the man, standing at the south fire, her fire, with a glass he was not drinking from, and when she stopped in the doorway, he said, "I hoped you would come down." She should have taken the carols and gone. She knew the arithmetic of her position better than she knew Latin. She crossed the room instead, and they stood on either side of the fire and talked about Christmases, his mother's and her father's, 2 children of utterly different houses who had each been made by one parent and orphaned by degrees, and the clock walked round to midnight, while neither of them looked at it. At midnight, the bells came faint from the village through the shutters. She said she must go up. He said yes. Neither of them moved. He looked at her then, as he had never yet permitted himself to look at her, openly, with the whole of his attention undefended, and she watched the fortification stand open for the first time, and what was inside it was not a duke at all. It was a man holding still the way you hold still near, a wild thing you cannot bear to startle. "Miss Crane," he said, low, and the words had the weight of a door swinging, and he had bent his head perhaps 3 inches toward her, and she had lifted her chin perhaps 1 when light fell across them both. Selina stood in the doorway with a candle. "Forgive me," she said, into a silence with edges on it. "I heard voices. How cosy you both look." She looked from the Duke to the governess and back, taking an inventory she would be spending from for the rest of her life. "Miss Crane, it is past midnight. Dinah wakes early on Christmas. I am sure you would not wish to be found wanting." Felicity took the carols from the table and went, past the candle and the violets and the eyes, and climbed to the nursery floor with her blood loud in her ears. Behind her in the library, cousin looked at cousin across 60 feet of carpet, and what passed between them had no words in it at all. And the next morning Selina Vane was the first one down, smiling, presiding over the Christmas table, as though presiding were a thing that could never be taken from her. Now, I have to pause the story here, because to feel the full weight of what is coming, you need to understand the single document on which a woman like Felicity McCrane's entire existence rested. It was called a character, a reference, a letter from her employer, attesting that she was honest, capable, and moral. In 1851, there was no agency that could overrule it, no court that would hear appeal against it, no record that could contradict it. A governess dismissed without a character was not merely unemployed. She was unemployable because the absence of the letter was itself the accusation, and every respectable household in England would read that silence and lock its doors. The law gave an employer no obligation to provide one, and gave the woman no remedy if it was refused. £26 a year, a trunk of books, and one sheet of paper that another person owned made up the whole estate of an educated woman in service. Remember that, because Selina Vane knew it too, and in the first week of January she reached for that sheet of paper with both hands. On the 2nd of January, Selina Vane climbed to the schoolroom for the first time in 18 months. She sat through the last quarter hour of a geography lesson with her hands folded, smiling at the child, and when the clock struck 4, she sent Dinah down to the housekeeper's room for her tea and closed the door behind her and turned around a different woman. The smile stayed. Everything behind it had been put away. She walked the room slowly, touching things, the globe, the slates, the squared pile of copybooks, the small table where the governess ate alone, taking possession of each object by handling it. "The library is to be closed for the winter inventory," she said to the window. "From tonight. I have told His Grace it cannot be put off another year, and he agrees because he is a man, and men agree to whatever spares them a domestic conversation. You will draw your books through Mrs. Quincy going forward." She turned then and looked at Felicity and let the look travel from her collar to her hem, pricing her £26 a year. "I signed the ledger myself this morning, so the figure is fresh in my mind. It is remarkable how much conversation £26 buys in some houses. I find I have begun to wonder what else it buys." Felicity stood by the slates and did not look away. "It buys Latin, Miss Vane, and arithmetic, and a child who can think. Nothing else in this house is for sale." "No," Selina said, and the smile finally reached her eyes, and that was the most frightening thing that had happened in the room. "Nothing else is. I am so glad we understand each other." She left the door open behind her. 4 days later, the brooch came out of its case. The brooch was sapphire and old gold, a spray of forget-me-nots that had belonged to the late Duchess, and it lived in a velvet case in the small jewel safe in the Duchess's old dressing room, which stood unused and was opened twice a year for cleaning. On the 6th of January, Selina Vane asked Mrs. Quincy, the housekeeper, to fetch it out, saying the Duke had agreed it should be looked over by the jeweller in Derby before Dinah was old enough to wear it. On the 7th of January, the case was found on the dressing-room table, open and empty. What happened next happened with the speed of a thing rehearsed. Selina did not raise an alarm. She went pale and quiet, which was far more effective, and asked Mrs. Quincy, in confidence, whether anything else had gone missing in the house in recent months. Then she went to the Duke. She was reluctant. She wept a little, at the dishonour of even saying it. She reminded him that she had defended Miss Crane's freedoms in the house, the borrowing of books, the late hours, the unusual liberties, and she said the word liberties like a card laid face up. And she told him that Nan Sayers, the upper housemaid who did the nursery corridor, had seen Miss Crane coming away from the Duchess's dressing room 2 evenings before, when Miss Crane had no duty that could explain her being in that wing at all. Nan Sayers was 20 and sharp, and had a brother in Sheffield, drowning in a debt to a man who broke fingers, and Selina Vane had known about the brother for a month before the brooch ever left its case, because that is what it means to run a house. The house reports to you. Nan stood in the Duke's study with her hands gripped together, and said her piece in a small, steady voice. The dressing-room door, the grey dress, the parcel held against Miss Crane's skirts, and every word of it had been built for her out of someone else's mouth, and she said it because the alternative was her brother's hands. The Duke heard it all in silence. Then he said the sentence that damned everyone in the story. Himself first of all. He said, "Search her room." They did it while Felicity was at lessons. Mrs. Quincy, who did not believe a syllable of it, and whose face said so, was made to stand witness, while Selina herself lifted the lid of the small trunk at the foot of the bed, moved aside the folded shifts with 2 fingers, as though the linen of a governess might mark her, and drew out, from beneath them, wrapped in a handkerchief that was not Felicity's, the sapphire spray of forget-me-nots. Mrs. Quincy said afterwards, said it for the rest of her life to anyone who would listen, that Miss Vane found that brooch the way you find a thing you have hidden yourself, with no searching in her hands at all. Nobody listened. Housekeepers are not heard against the family. That is also what it means to run a house. They sent for Felicity at 4 o'clock. She came down from the schoolroom with chalk on her cuff, expecting a question about Dinah's progress, and walked into a study that held the Duke at the window, with his back half-turned, Selina, seated by the fire with her handkerchief, the brooch lying on the desk on its square of cloth like a small blue accusation, and the air of a room in which a verdict has already been read once aloud to make sure of the wording. Understanding came like ice giving way, all at once and from below. "That is the Duchess's brooch," she said, because someone had to begin, and the 2 who knew the script were waiting. "It was found in your trunk." The Duke spoke to the window. The snow was coming down into the dusk, and he watched it as though it were the thing requiring his attention. "Under your linen, an hour ago." Mrs. Quincy stood witness. Then someone placed it there. Her voice stayed level. She was a schoolmaster's daughter. Levelness was the family trade. "Your Grace, look at me and say you believe I took it." And here is the moment, listeners. Here is the hinge the whole story turns on. The 3 seconds that cost 2 people 7 years. He did turn. He looked at her, chalk on her cuff, chin up, eyes steady on his, and everything in him that had sat across 60 feet of library carpet from this woman knew. But a man who has built a fortification does not trust what comes over the wall. He trusts the wall, and the wall said that the evidence was physical, the witness was sworn, his cousin was weeping, and the alternative, the thing his chest was shouting up at him, was that he wanted this woman innocent because he wanted this woman, and that want was exactly the unsound footing his entire careful life had been engineered against. From inside the fortification, believing her looked exactly like surrender, and condemning her wore the costume of discipline. He was 31 years old, and he had never once in his life been taught the difference. "What I believe is not the question," he said. "The question is what was found. It is the only question, Your Grace. It is the question you will be answering for the rest of your life." Selina's handkerchief paused at her cheek, just for a breath. The Duke came around the desk. He had decided, and like everything he did, the decision arrived, complete, armoured, with the exit sealed. He told her there would be no prosecution. He said it as though it were mercy, and Selina had counted on that too, because a magistrate means questions. And questions are one thing a planted brooch cannot survive. But mercy needs no witnesses. There would be no character, he said. She had 1 hour to pack her trunk, and the carriage would take her as far as the turnpike and no further, and that her wages would be paid to quarter day, and that Lady Dinah would be told the governess had been called away. And through all of it he looked at her left shoulder, at the wall, at the snow, at everything in the room except her eyes, because he could not survive her eyes, and that was the only honest testimony he gave that day. 1 hour, Felicity said. He looked at the brooch on the desk, and at the woman by the fire, who looked back at her over the lace edge of the handkerchief, with eyes as dry as August. "You have been 10 years arranging this house, Miss Vane. I hope it keeps you warm." Then she turned to the man. He had given her 1 hour, and she spent the first 30 seconds of it the only way she could afford. "I have taught your sister for 18 months that the truth needs no protector, because it protects itself. You have just made me a liar to a child. That is the theft that happened in this house today, Your Grace, and you are the one who committed it." She walked out. She did not weep on the stairs, where the maids could see, or in the schoolroom, where the smell of chalk nearly broke her, or in her room, folding 18 months into one trunk with hands that would not stop shaking, no matter what she told them. She left the books he had lent her in a squared pile on the bed. On top of the pile, she left the page of Caesar that Dinah had construed the day his shadow first filled the schoolroom door, and she left no note, because everything a note could say was in the choosing of that page. Now, you might be asking why she went so quietly. Why not demand the magistrate herself insist on the law fight? It is the right question, and the answer is the cold arithmetic of 1851. Larceny of an object worth more than a shilling was a felony, and a felony conviction could mean years in prison. And England was still within living memory of transporting convicts to the far side of the world for less than that brooch was worth. At trial, it would have been her word against a sworn housemaid, physical evidence found before a witness, and the testimony of a duke's family, weighed by 12 propertied men who had been raised from the cradle to believe that servants steal and gentlefolk do not lie. The mercy of no prosecution was the only mercy on offer, and refusing it meant gambling her liberty on the fairness of a system built by the people accusing her. She had no family to shelter her, no savings beyond £8 sewn into her stays, and 1 hour. She made the only move on the board, and she survived. The carriage put her down at the turnpike at 6 o'clock with her trunk, in the dark, in falling snow, 7 miles from the nearest town where a coach could be had, and the carriage turned around and left her there, because those were its orders, and orders in that house came from the woman who arranged things. Felicity Crane stood at a crossroads in Derbyshire in January with everything she owned and began to walk. The snow turned to sleet inside the first mile. Her boots went through at the second. Somewhere past the 3rd milestone, she stopped being able to feel her hands on the trunk ropes, and she left the trunk in the lee of a wall, marking the place in her mind with a schoolmistress's precision, even as her own mind began to drift at the edges, and she walked on through the dark with the sleet coming sideways, one woman alone on a turnpike road at night, listening for wheels she could not decide whether to want. Because a woman alone on a night road has nearly as much to lose from the help as from the cold. By the time she saw the carrier's cottage at Hollin Cross, a smear of lamplight through the ice on the air, she had stopped shivering, and if you know anything about cold, you know that the moment you stop shivering is the moment the cold has stopped negotiating. She got one fist against the door. The carrier's wife, a woman named Hannah Dost, who in a just world would have statues, opened it to find a young woman frozen to the bone on her step, and asked no questions until the third day, when the fever broke. I have to stop here for a moment. When I was writing this scene, I had to get up and walk away from my desk, and I want to be honest with you about why. It was not the sleet, it was the trunk. It was the image of a woman setting down everything she owns by a wall in the dark, memorizing the spot, because even half frozen, even thrown away by the people she served, she is still keeping account, still being precise, still the thing they refused to believe she was, which some of you listening have set down a trunk like that in your own lives. You know exactly what that wall feels like. This next part of the story is for you. 7 years passed. Hold that number in your hands for a moment, because the story is about to cross it in a sentence, and Felicity Crane had to cross it a day at a time. She crossed her first winter sewing shirts in a Bath attic at twopence apiece, eyes ruined by candlelight, because sewing asks no questions about characters. Her second year brought a post reading aloud to a blind wool merchant's widow, got on the strength of her voice, alone. Then came a junior teacher's place at a small school for tradesmen's daughters on Walcott Street, under an old mistress named Miss Heseltine, who looked at the gap in Felicity's history, listened to her decline, a Latin noun, and made the wager of her life on the evidence of her own ears. Felicity taught there 5 years. When Miss Heseltine died, she left the lease, the furniture and 14 pupils to her junior teacher in a will 1 page long, and over the door of the narrow stone house the painter put up new letters that read Crane House School for Girls, and the woman who had once been given 1 hour to leave Derbyshire's stood on the pavement and watched the brush make the final E of her own name, and went inside and taught the afternoon arithmetic lesson, because the lesson was owed. Now, it is important to understand what an achievement that was, because of the arithmetic of 1858 was stacked against her at every step. A woman in England that year could not vote, could barely contract in her own name if she married, and the whole catalogue of respectable work open to an educated single woman ran to about 3 entries: governess, companion, teacher, and every one of them depended on reputation as a lamp depends on oil. For a woman with a hole in her history to climb from piecework sewing to the ownership of a school, vouched for by nothing except the daily evidence of her own competence, was a feat roughly comparable to building a house with one hand while the other is tied. She built it. By the spring of 1858, Crane House had a waiting list, a reputation for sending out girls who could keep books and pass a sentence, and a proprietress of 31 whom the parents of Bath called formidable, which is the word the English use for a woman they cannot condescend to. She also had that spring a suitor. Dr. Ellis Forbes was the physician who attended the school, a widower of 40 with kind hands and a sensible practice, and for a year he had been calling on Thursdays with a punctuality that announced itself. He was a good man. I want to be fair to him, because the story is not. He saw exactly what Felicity Crane was worth, and he asked nothing about the hole in her history. And on the first Thursday of May, he sat in her small parlour, turning his hat brim through his fingers, and told her that his house was too quiet and his admiration too established for further delay, and that he would call again on Sunday for her answer. She did not say no. Mark that. After 7 years of building a life out of stone and arithmetic, a kind man with a quiet house is not nothing. She said she would give him her answer on Sunday, and she meant to say yes. And she spent the 3 days in between telling herself that the flat, careful feeling in her chest was what contentment felt like for women who had learned better than to want. The Duke of Fenmore spent those same 7 years learning what his hour had cost. It came to him in installments. Dinah first, a 9-year-old who could not be lied to, who hunted the house for her governess for a week, and then stopped asking with an abruptness worse than the asking, and who looked at her brother across the schoolroom. Her new governess could not fill in a way that took something off him every day for a year. Mrs. Quincy next, who gave her notice that spring after 30 years' service, and when pressed for a reason stood in his study with her hands folded and said, "I stood witness to the search, your grace. I'd not stand witness to another," and left him to live with the sentence. Then the library, which he shut up again, fires unlit, because he could not sit at the north desk, without the south chair, shouting. And then, in the autumn of 1854, the war, which he went to, because he was 34 and hollow, and the Crimea was hiring. He raised a company. He served on a general staff through that first murderous before Sevastopol, and he learned in the snow above Balaclava the lesson Derbyshire had failed to teach him, that men freeze to death exactly as fast in a just cause as in an unjust one, and that the difference between an order and the truth is the difference between the wall and what comes over it. He was decorated. He came home in 1856 leaner, greyer at the temples at 36, and altered in a way the county could see across a church, and Selina Vane, who had spent his absence as mistress of Larkmoor in everything except the name, met his carriage on the steps, and understood within one look that whatever she had been holding herself for was never coming. She married Sir Morton Grimley, a baronet, with a name worth having, and debts worth hiding, the following spring. The county called it a sensible match. The county was wrong on both words. And then, in November of 1857, a letter came to Larkmoor from a chaplain in Sheffield, written at the dictation of a dying woman, and the Duke of Larkmoor sat down at his study desk to read it, and did not stand up again for 4 hours. Nan Sayers was 27 and consumptive, and past saving, and she spent the last of her breath putting it all on paper. The brother, the debt, the man who broke fingers. She set down Miss Vane's first approach in the still room with the debt already paid, and the receipt held just out of reach. The words she had been given to say, rehearsed twice in Miss Vane's own sitting room until she had them smooth. The handkerchief, which was Miss Vane's, sacrificed to the trunk, and the one detail that broke the Duke worse than all the rest together, that on the night the governess was put down at the turnpike, Nan had stood the gallery window and watched the carriage lamps go down the avenue into the sleet, and had been sick into the wash basin, and had then gone down and served the family's dinner, because her brother still had fingers and meant to keep them. The chaplain added 3 lines of his own. She asks no forgiveness for herself. She asks only that your grace find the lady, because the lady was innocent, and Nan Sayers goes to God knowing it. He went to Selina first. I will tell you about that conversation later in the story. At the moment it has earned, because what he took away from her sitting room that December afternoon is the loaded gun, the last act of this story fires. What you need to know now is that he spent the next 5 months looking for a woman who had every reason to stay lost. England in 1858 had no registry that could find a person who did not wish finding. He hired men. He followed 7 years of cold trail through Derby and Nottingham and a sewing attic in Bath, whose landlady remembered the quiet one with the beautiful voice, and on the second Friday of May, the day before Felicity Crane meant to accept a kind man with a quiet house, a carriage with no arms on the door stopped on Walcott Street. Greying gentleman stood on the pavement for a long moment, looking up at the letters over the school door, reading her name, and then rang the bell. She was hearing the senior girl's French when the maid brought the card up. The name on it took the sound out of the room. She stood at the head of her own classroom in her own school, in the life she had cut from raw rock, with her bare hands, holding a square of pasteboard, and she was for 3 seconds back in a study with chalk on her cuff and snow coming down. Outside the window, the girls saw their formidable mistress go white and then go calm, and the calm was the more frightening of the two. She finished the French verb on the board. "Remember that detail, I beg you." She finished the verb, because the lesson was owed, and the lesson was hers, and no Duke alive was going to take another hour from her. Then she handed the class to her assistant, and went down to the parlour, and opened the door on the man who had ended her first life, standing by her window with his hat in both hands like a tenant come about the rent. "Miss Crane?" He had rehearsed this. You could hear the rehearsal failing in real time, line by line, under the level grey gaze of a schoolmistress who had once watched him address her. Window. "Thank you for receiving me. You were received because my girls were watching, Your Grace, and a refused duke makes talk a school cannot afford. You have the use of 10 minutes. I would not unpack the hat." He laid the confession on her table instead. He had brought the original every page in Nan's chaplain's careful hand, and he stood holding the back of a chair while she read it, and he watched her read the account of her own destruction with a stillness that he recognized, because he had once watched her be accused with exactly that stillness, and had let the wall outvote it. She read every page. She squared the pages on the table when she finished, the way she squared everything, and the touch of her fingers on that paper was the only gentleness in the room, and it was for Nan. "Her brother," she said. "Does he still have his hands?" Of every sentence in the English language, that was the one he had not prepared for. "He does. The debt was paid. Before she died, I settled an annuity on the chaplain's parish at her asking for the man who nursed her." "Good." Felicity stood. "Then, the only person in this story who needed something from you has had it." "Thank you for bringing me the truth, Your Grace. It took the long way round. You know where the door is. I came to ask your forgiveness. I know what you came to ask." She said it without heat, and the absence of heat was the costliest thing in the room. "7 years ago you stood in your study and told me that what you believed was not the question. You were wrong, and you have crossed England to tell me so, and I am glad for you, truly, because I remember what it is to carry a thing that has no place to be set down. But understand what you are asking. An apology in a bath parlour costs you a morning. The accusation cost me everything, and it was made in front of your household and your cousin, and entered into the silent record of the county, and your remorse, Your Grace, is addressed to your own conscience. It is no use whatever to my name." She moved to the door and opened it, and the spring noise of her school came up the stairs. 20 girls' voices at the conjugations, the life she had built, filling the doorway around her like an honour guard. "I was tried in public. I will not be pardoned in private. Good morning. He went. That is the measure of how far the war and the 7 years had carried him, that he did not stand on his rank or his anguish. He picked up his hat, and he went, and on the pavement of Walcott Street, the most feared man in Derbyshire that stood for a moment with his eyes shut like a man absorbing a blow he had paid for in advance. But he did not leave Bath. He took rooms at the York House Hotel, and he sat down that evening and did what he had done on a general's staff in front of Sevastopol when the direct assault had failed and the siege began. He took out paper and he began to plan a public surrender. Mark that word, surrender, because the plan he sat drawing up in a Bath hotel that night was going to require the 6th Duke of Fenmore to do, in front of 140 witnesses, a thing no man of his rank had ever been seen to do in the length of England, and he knew it, and he wrote on. But a campaign moves on many roads at once, and the first thing he sent north was not an invitation. It was a question about a trunk, and Felicity Crane went back up to her classroom and taught the rest of the French lesson with perfect composure. And that night, alone in her sitting room, she opened the drawer where she had put the confession and read it again by candlelight and sat afterwards for a long time, with her hand flat on the cover of her father's Greek lexicon, which had crossed 7 years, and a sewing attic with her. And if you had asked her what she was feeling, she could not have told you, because what do you call it when the cell door is opened 7 years after you stopped waiting, and the man holding it open is the one who locked you in, and underneath the 7 years of scar the oldest wound in you notes, against every instruction, that the grey at his temples suits him. There is no word for that. She blew out the candle. Sunday was coming, and a kind man with a quiet house, and she had an answer to give. She did not give it. Dr. Forbes came on Sunday, and she heard herself ask him for a month, and he took it like the gentleman he was, and walked home through the spring evening, having understood, from one look at her face, when she opened the door, considerably more than she had said. Kind men are not blind men. That is what makes their kindness expensive. What followed was the strangest courtship in the history of Bath, if courtship is even the word, because the Duke of Fenmore did not court her. He reported to her twice a week a letter to the school, and the letters did not plead, and did not flatter, and did not presume. They wrote that he had found Mrs. Quincy in a cottage in Matlock, and told her she had been right, to her face, with her nephew in the room to hear it. Another letter reported that Hannah Doost of Holland Cross, who had opened a door one January night and asked no questions, would never want for anything again, and that the trunk Felicity had set down by the wall, past the 3rd milestone, had been found that same winter by the carrier, and kept 7 years in a loft against the day someone came for it, and was on its way to Bath by carrier's van, every book in it. He wrote about Dinah, 16 now, who, on being told the whole truth, had not spoken to her brother for 9 days, and then had appeared in his study with her old Latin grammar, and the page of Caesar that a governess had left on a pile of books which she had taken in secret 7 years before and kept hidden ever since, as other girls keep a locket. And then one morning in June the carrier's van came to Walcott Street, and 2 men carried in a water-stained trunk with the ropes still on it, and behind the trunk, unannounced, came a tall girl of 16, who walked into the parlour, looked at the schoolmistress standing over the open trunk, with a ruined Greek lexicon in her hands, and said, "You used to tell me the truth protects itself. I have been waiting 7 years to watch it do it." And Lady Dinah, who had been 9, and was the only person in this story with nothing to atone for and nothing to gain, crossed the parlour and put her arms around her governess. And that, listeners, is the moment Felicity Crane finally wept. She had not wept in the study, nor on the turnpike, nor in the sewing attic. She wept in her own parlour, in her own school, over a drowned trunk of her father's books held by her pupil. 7 years, and the dam came down at the touch of the one hand in all of it that had never done her any harm. I know some of you are shouting at me right now. I can hear you from here. You are saying, "Let the Duke grovel another year. She owes him nothing. She has the school and the doctor and her name on the door. Why should the man be forgiven at all?" Hold that thought. Carry it with you through what is coming, because this story does not ask her to choose between justice and love, and I will not have her trade one for the other. What this story asks is whether a debt that cannot be repaid can still be honestly answered, and you are about to watch a duke attempt it in front of 140 witnesses. But before we get there, there is a knock coming at the school door, and it is not a friendly one. Because news travels, and one lady in Derbyshire had heard by midsummer exactly where the Duke of Larkmore was spending his weeks, and Selina Grimley had a husband, and the husband had debts, and a drowning man will grab at anything, even a schoolmistress. Sir Morton Grimley arrived at Crane House on a Tuesday afternoon in July, with brandy on his breath at 4 o'clock and the courage of a man whose creditors have begun calling in the mornings. You should understand his position, because desperation has a logic. His marriage had bought him a beautiful wife, and the expectation of Larkmore connection, and instead the connection had gone cold. The Duke had quietly bought up the worst of his paper through agents that spring, and now there was talk moving through the clubs ahead of any fact that old business at Larkmore was about to be reopened, and that his wife stood at the centre of it. A scandal would not merely embarrass Selina, it would finish him, because credit is reputation wearing a different coat, and his whole estate was credit. So he came to Bath to stop the leak at what he took to be its source, a schoolmistress, a nobody, a woman men like Sir Morton had been managing all their lives. She received him in the parlour because refusing him meant a scene on her doorstep in term time. He began with money, a draft for £500 if she would close the school quietly and take her history abroad. Brussels was full of English schools, a woman of her abilities. She let him finish, which he mistook for consideration. Then she told him that her history was not for sale, because it was not for shame, that the confession was no longer the only copy of itself, and that he could carry that home to Derbyshire with her compliments. The brandy did the rest. He came out of the chair, telling her what a word from him in the right ears could do to a school kept by a woman with a hole in her past, and when she walked to the bell-pull he caught her wrist to stop her, and his grip meant nothing by it, except the habit of a man who has never once been refused by anyone who could not afford to refuse him. And that was the moment the parlour door opened, because Lady Dinah had a standing Tuesday invitation to tea, and her brother had driven her. I want to describe exactly what the Duke of Larkmore did, because what he did not do is the whole point of it. He did not shout. He crossed the parlour in 4 strides, took Sir Morton's wrist in one hand, and broke the grip with a single turn that put the baronet 2 steps back into the chair he had risen from. And then he stood quite still between the man and the woman, and when he spoke, the voice was the one he had used on a frozen staff officer's ridge above a battle, low, unhurried, and entirely without a future in it for the listener. You have laid your hand on her in her own house. I am going to give you one chance to leave this room before I conduct you out of it through the window. And Sir Morton? I am obliged to tell you that I have been hoping for several weeks that you would decline." Sir Morton looked up at him and then past him at the schoolmistress, doing sums, because even drunk he could do sums, the bought-up paper, the dead-cold eyes, and he took his hat and went, and they heard the street door slam, and the parlour was suddenly very quiet, with Dinah in the doorway, round-eyed, and the tea-things rattling on the tray in the maid's hands behind her. Felicity! The Duke had her wrist now, but in both hands, turning it to the light, with a gentleness that stood at a strange angle to what his voice had just been, looking at the marks of another man's fingers going red on her skin, and he moved his thumb once across her pulse, and the room tilted. 7 years, a war, a confession, 2 months of letters, and the whole architecture of distance they had both been so carefully maintaining came down to a thumb, against a pulse, and her name in his mouth, without the miss in front of it, and she looked up from her own wrist to his face, and found it undefended again, the fortification, standing open the way it had stood open at midnight on a Christmas Eve, with bells coming faint through the shutters, and he bent his head, and she did not step back along any shelf, and Dinah, 16 years old and merciless, said from the doorway, "The tea is getting cold," in the voice of a girl who intends to be telling this story at dinners for the next 40 years. The Duke stepped back. Felicity reclaimed her wrist and her composure in the same motion, and said something about cups, but the tide had shown itself, and everyone in the room had seen the water move. And that evening, after Dinah had been driven home, Felicity Crane sat alone in her parlour for a long time, and then she took out paper and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Dr. Ellis Forbes, and it was kind, and it was final. And he answered it 2 days later, with 3 lines that prove some men deserve better stories than the one they are, standing in. He wrote, "I asked for your hand, knowing it was the finest I would ever ask for. I find the verdict was already in. He has my envy, and you have my friendship. And Crane House has its physician for as long as it wants one." The second letter was to the Duke of Larkmore at the York House Hotel, and it was 4 sentences long, and the last of them said, "You once gave me an hour. I will give you an evening. Make the truth as public as the lie, and we will see what is left standing afterward." He had been waiting 2 months for that letter. The invitations went out from Larkmore within 10 days to 140 people, the whole standing county, every family that had dined under that roof in the winter of 1851, and carried the story of the thieving governess home in. The carriage afterwards, a reception to mark Lady Dinah's 16th year, and her brother's intention, as the cards put it, of setting his house in order. Selina grimly received hers at breakfast and understood it precisely, because she had spent her whole life reading invitations the way generals read maps. She also understood that she could not refuse. The Duke held her husband's debts in his 2 hands. Attendance was the price of their suspension, and Sir Morton, sweated sober and shown the figures, would have carried her into Derbyshire over his shoulder. She came in grey silk, magnificent, and she walked into the great hall of the house. She had spent 10 years expecting to rule with her chin high and her hand on her husband's arm, and a plan, because she had never in her life entered any room without one. Her plan was simple. She would deny everything. The case against her rested on a dead housemaid's ramblings and a duke deranged by guilt over a dismissed servant he had grown too fond of, and it would come down to her word, a lady's word, against a ghost's. It was not a bad plan. Against the confession alone, it might even have held. But the Duke of Larkmore had been to her sitting-room the previous December, and I promised to tell you about that. And now is the moment. He had laid Nan's confession before her, and Selina had been flawless. She produced tears for the poor, deluded, dying creature, and then wounded astonishment that he could entertain such a fancy. He had left her house that day, nearly persuaded he had run mad. That is how good she was. And then 3 days later, a letter had come, in her own hand, on her own paper, and it did not deny anything. It negotiated. It informed him, in sentences polished like sterling, that if he raised this matter, she would be compelled to tell the county what she had observed in the winter of 1851, a duke and a governess alone, past midnight, and to suggest that the theft had been a fiction the duke himself arranged to remove a mistress grown inconvenient, and that she doubted his little schoolmistress's name would enjoy the airing. He read that letter 3 times. Then he locked it in the dispatch case where he kept the things that mattered, and he said aloud, alone in his study, the sentence that the last act of this story was built on. Innocent women threaten nothing. She came north the day before, with Dinah for company. On the rail journey, Mrs. Quincy reinstalled at Larkmoor for the occasion, which answered propriety, and a room taken at the Greyhound in Matlock, which answered it twice. But there was business to settle before the evening could be allowed to happen. Because Felicity Crane had not built a school by leaving the wording of important documents to other people, and so at dusk she came up the avenue she had last travelled going the other way in the sleet, and was shown, at her own request, past the drawing-room and into the library. Both fires were lit. She stopped 2 steps inside the door when she saw it, because she had heard from Dinah that the room had stood shut for 7 years, and here it was warm and breathing. The south fire built high, her chair, where it had always been, and a man at the north desk who rose when she entered, and then made himself stay where he was, 60 feet off, observing the old treaty. "You said an evening," he said. "I am informed that begins tomorrow. Tonight you may inspect the terms." She inspected them. She made him say it all through, what he would tell the hall, and in what order, the confession, the chaplain, Mrs. Quincy, the letter, and she stopped him twice. Once to strike out a sentence that excused him, and once to strike out a sentence that flattered her, and he took both corrections, like a man being construed by his betters, which by then he understood himself to be. When it was done, the clock said 11, and neither of them had sat down in the last half hour, and somewhere in the saying of it, they had stopped being 60 feet apart. Because rooms do that to people who are not watching themselves, and she found she was standing at the south fire, and he at the corner of the mantel, near enough that she could see the campaign. Had cost him too. The grey, the new economy in how he held himself, a man who had been spending out of his own marrow for 7 years. "Ask me what you keep not asking," she said. "What if it is not enough?" He said it to the fire. "The hall, the kneeling, all of it. What if I do every part of it right?" And the answer is still no. I have had 5 months to plan tomorrow, and I cannot plan past that question. "Then you will stand up off the marble and live, your grace, the same as I did." She watched the words land, and watched him take them standing. "But you may have this much on account. 7 years ago I left this room, wanting one thing from you, and it was not a brooch, and it was not a character." She picked up her gloves from the chair, her chair, and the picking up of them was the only thing that kept her hands from a worse errand. "Tomorrow first, then we will discuss the rest of the inventory." He came down the room to light her to the door, and at the door, for a moment, they were 2 people in a doorway at midnight with bells somewhere in both their memories, and he had bent his head before he caught himself, and stopped and held there, close enough that her own held breath went loud in her ears. And what he did next was the hardest discipline of a disciplined life. "Tomorrow first," he said, and stepped back and gave her the candle. She walked down to the carriage, glad of the dark, because no schoolmistress in England could have governed her own face just then. And behind her in the house, he stood in the doorway of the library, until the carriage lamps were out of sight, doing what he did, which was keeping count. The evening came. The great hall of Larkmoor was lit the way it had not been lit since the old Duke's day, 400 candles down the length of the marble, and the county arrived in its silks and its decorations and its appetite, because everyone had understood from the wording of those cards that something was to happen, and nothing draws the English like the scent of something about to happen. Felicity Crane arrived last by design. In a carriage the Duke had sent, and a gown of deep blue she had paid for herself, also by design, and when she came up the steps of the house she had left at 6 o'clock, in the dark with a thief's name on her, Mrs. Quincy was standing at the doors, brought from Matlock at the Duke's request, and stationed there at her own, and the old housekeeper took the governess's hand in both of hers in front of every arriving family in Derbyshire and said, "Welcome back, Miss Crane," loud enough to carry, and that was the first shot of the evening. Fired before the host had said a word, he gave them dinner first. He let Selina sit through 11 courses at his table, in the room she had presided over for a decade, watching him not look at her. And if you think that was not deliberate, you have not been paying attention to what 7 years had made of this man. Then, with the cloth drawn and the company gathered in the great hall, the 6th Duke of Larkmoor stood up before 140 of his neighbours, with Lady Dinah on his right hand, and said that before the dancing he had an account to settle, because his house could not be set in order until it was set true. And he told them, January of 1851, the brooch, the search, the trunk, all of it flat and exact, a staff officer's report, sparing himself nothing, and the hall went so still that the candles could be heard. And then he said that the woman dismissed from this house had been innocent, that he held the sworn deathbed confession of the housemaid suborned to accuse her, and that the person who had taken the brooch from its case paid the maid with her brother's safety, and placed the Duchess's sapphires in a governess's trunk with her own hands, was present in this hall tonight. Selina grimly did not flinch. "I will give her that to her grave." The woman was made of marble all the way through. She rose. She let her voice fill the hall the way 10 years as its hostess had taught her, and she did it well. The grief, the disbelief, poor Nan, dying minds wander, and as for whatever spite the woman's family bore her, she would not dignify. She would only say that she had loved this house and served it, and that some persons present might ask themselves why a great man takes up a dismissed servant's cause with such heat, and what that heat had been in the winter of 1851. It was perfectly aimed. You could feel the hall waver. 140 people, remembering that ladies do not lie, and governesses are nobody, the old arithmetic, the jury that is always in session. Felicity stood in the centre of it, with her spine straight and her hands still, being weighed one more time by people who had never once weighed her honestly, and she said nothing, because she had already learned at 24 what the truth was worth in that scale unassisted. The Duke let his cousin finish. Then he said, "You wrote me a letter in December, madam. Shall I return it?" and took it from his breast pocket and read it to the hall. Every polished sentence. The observation she stood ready to share. The fiction she stood ready to suggest. The doubt that a schoolmistress's name would enjoy the airing. He read it slowly, and the hall heard what it was, because there are 200 ways to deny an accusation, and negotiation is none of them. And when he reached the end, he held the page up so that the nearest dozen guests could see the hand it was written in. The hand half the county had received its invitations in for 10 years. "Innocent women threaten nothing," he said into the silence. My cousin priced her silence before she ever prested her innocence. I have the chaplain of St. Silas Sheffield in this hall tonight, who took the confession at the bedside and will swear to every word. I have Mrs. Quincy, 30 years housekeeper of Larkmoor, who stood witness to the search, and will tell you what she saw in it. I require none of them. The letter is sufficient. Her own hand is sufficient. It broke quietly. That is how it goes in such rooms. No shrieking, no swoon, just a slow turning away. 140 people executing the cut direct in a single coordinated movement, like a tide changing, fans coming up, shoulders presenting, the space around the grey silk gown widening foot by foot until Selina Grimley stood in an emptiness in the middle of the fullest room in Derbyshire. Sir Morton did not take her arm. Watch him, he is instructive. He stepped back from his own wife with the smooth instinct of a man abandoning a sinking investment, and it was the Duke who ended it, with a sentence of judgment as cold and proportioned as anything he ever signed. The Grimley debts would be suspended, he said, for exactly as long as Lady Grimley resided at her husband's property in Northumberland, year-round, and the day she appeared in London, in Bath, in Derbyshire, in any drawing-room in England, the paper came due in full. It was banishment, dressed as bookkeeping. She had spent her life climbing toward the centre of every room, and he sentenced her to the one thing she could not survive, which was distance, and she knew it. And for just one moment, the marble cracked and the hall saw what had lived behind 10 years of perfect hostessing. And then she gathered the grey silk and walked out of Larkmoor through the great doors, with her head up, past Mrs. Quincy, who looked at her the way you look at weather, and that was the last time polite England ever saw Selina Grimley. The hall let out its breath, and the Duke of Larkmoor turned to face Felicity Crane across the marble, in front of all of them, and the second act of the evening began, the one the county would still be retelling at dinners 30 years on. The lie was my cousin's, he said. The believing was mine. No one compelled me. I was shown a planted brooch and a frightened girl's rehearsed words on one side, and on the other side a woman I had watched across this house for 2 years, whose whole character was in evidence every day in the person of my own sister. And I weighed them, and I chose wrong. And I chose wrong because believing her felt like wanting her, and I had been raised to treat my own wanting as the least trustworthy witness in any room. I gave her 1 hour. She had given this house 18 months of patience and excellence, and a child who can think, and I gave her 1 hour and a turnpike in the snow. He stopped. The hall did not move. There is no restoring what that took. Her name I can restore, and have, and every person here will carry the truth of it out of this house tonight, and they will repeat it, because they repeated the other thing. But the rest is not mine to settle by speaking. So I will ask, and she may answer as she pleases, and her answer will stand in this hall either way. And then, listeners in front of 140 guests, in front of the families who had dined out on her disgrace for 7 years, in front of his sister and his servants, and the portrait of the mother whose brooch it had been, the 6th Duke of Larkmoor went down on his knees on the Italian marble of his own great hall, and the sound that went through that room was the sound a county makes when its foundations move. Miss Crane, I am not asking you to absolve me. and I am not fool enough tonight to ask you for more than this. I am asking you to forgive me, in front of every witness the original sin could have wanted. And if you cannot, then refuse me in front of them too. And let that also be public, and I will spend what remains of my life in your debt regardless. Because the debt does not depend on the answer. She looked down at him for a long time. The hall has its versions of how long. She looked at the grey at his temples, and the medals he had not worn, and the man who had crossed England, bought up a coward's debts, armed himself with a vain woman's letter, summoned the county, and knelt, and she heard, under all of it, a girl of 9 asking what singular meant, and her own voice answering that the truth needs no protector because it protects itself, the sentence she had believed broken in his study 7 years ago. Standing upright in the middle of this hall after all, having simply taken the long way round. "Stand up, Your Grace," she said, and her voice carried to the back of the hall, schoolroom trained. "You have knelt in the right room, before the right witnesses, and a thing done properly need only be done once. I forgive you the hour." She waited while he rose, and then she finished it, and the finish was hers alone. 7 years I do not forgive, because they are not yours to be forgiven, for they are mine. I built them. I am given to understand my school is the best in Bath, and I would not trade a day of it to have been believed by a man who needed a deathbed to manage it. You did not destroy me, Your Grace. You inconvenienced me. Magnificently. Now ask me the other thing, the thing you came to Bath for, because the witnesses are assembled and I am wearing the good gown, and I do not intend to dress this well twice. The hall laughed and wept at once. That sound, you know the one. And Dinah was already crying with both hands over her mouth, and the Duke of Fenmore, standing now, looked at the school mistress in deep blue, and did the last undefended thing in front of everyone, no fortification left anywhere in him. "Marry me," he said. "I have loved you since a November afternoon I was too much a coward to act on, and too much a fool to deserve. Marry me, and keep the school, keep the name on the door, keep every stone of the life you built without me. I am not asking to replace it. I am asking to be admitted to it. Felicity, please." "Yes," she said, "you may get up off your knees in your dreams tonight, Your Grace. In this hall, you stayed down long enough." The hall came apart into noise. He crossed the marble through all of it, took her hand, drew the glove from it with a gentleness that contradicted every legend the county held about him, and pressed his mouth to her bare knuckles in front of 140 witnesses, holding it there. One beat past what was decent, which was the point. And somewhere near the back of the hall, the vicar's wife, who had laughed at a dinner in 1851, was heard to begin a sentence and decide against it. Later, when the county had finally gone home to begin 30 years of retelling it, 2 people sat alone in the library of Larkmore, both fires lit for the first time in 7 years, and he put into her hands a flat dispatch case, locked, the key already in it. Inside were letters 100 and more, dated, folded, sealed, and never sent. The first, written the same week she left, when he still believed her guilty and wrote anyway, because his hand would not obey the verdict. They went on through the years. There was a letter dated the night before Inkerman that began, "If I am to be ashamed before God tomorrow, let me at least be exact about the inventory." There were letters from the hotel in Bath, written hours after she had shown him the door, reporting his own dismissal to her like a man filing the only honest dispatch of his career. She read for a long time by the south fire, in the chair that had waited, while he sat at the north desk, not pretending to write, watching her as he had watched her across 2 years and 60 feet of carpet. And when she finally looked up, He said, "I never learned how to stop. I am told it is a flaw." And she said, "It is the only reference you have, Your Grace. Fortunately for you, I am known to hire on the evidence of my own ears." One more thing before we close, because it is the detail I most want you to carry home. They were married that autumn. And in 1858 the law of England held that a married woman's property passed to her husband. All of it, her earnings, her lease, her school, the moment the ring went on. The doctrine was called coverture, and it meant that the wedding that crowned Felicity Crane could also, by pure operation of law, have quietly accomplished what Selina Vane never managed, the taking of everything she had built. The Duke knew it. Before the banns were read, his lawyers drew a marriage settlement, the instrument wealthy families used to shelter a bride's property from the husband's absolute rights. And Crane House School, its lease, its income and its governance, were vested in trust to Felicity alone, untouchable by him or his heirs forever. He signed away his legal claim to the one thing she loved that he had not given her. The county thought it eccentric. She knew it for what it was, the only apology that exists in contract form, and on the first page of the trust deed, where the law required the property to be described, the school is listed in the clerk's copperplate as the entire estate of a woman of independent character. She framed that page. It hung in her study at Crane House for 40 years, and pupils who asked about it were told the whole story. Every January, on the anniversary of a night when a woman walked 7 miles through the sleet and did not die, so that every girl who passed through that school went out into England knowing exactly what a reference was worth, who gets to write one, and what it costs the world when nobody asks the woman. And that is the story. So tell me, because I want to know, what would you have done in her place, standing in that hall with the most powerful man in Derbyshire, on his knees on the marble? Would you have forgiven him? Would you have made him wait another 7 years? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and tell me which moment hit you hardest, the trunk by the wall, Dinah in the parlour, or the letter read aloud to the county. If you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe so you do not miss what I am telling you next, because I am already deep in it and it might be the darkest one yet. Until then, take care of yourselves, and remember what Felicity Crane knew all along. The truth protects itself. Sometimes it just takes the long way round. Good night.